Astrology, Science or Art? From the book The New Guide to Astrology by Ciro Discepolo. Astrology has existed since 5,000 years ago. It is the most ancient science of the world. But is it science or art? There are contrasting opinions on this point. Wishing to allow the reader to face up to this universe for the first time and get a basically objective picture of it, in the following lines, I have summarized a brief history of astrology, also including an overview of its main fields of application, the categories in which it is subdivided, the main accusations it receives, and the relevant answers to those criticisms. Astrology can be defined as the component of human thought that studies the relationship between the spatial position of the heavenly bodies of our solar system and the corresponding events occurring on Earth, which are supposed to be significantly related with the above-mentioned celestial positions. The oldest information concerning astrology dates back to the time of the 4th Egyptian dynasty, more or less in the year 2800 BC. There is evidence to confidently prove that in those times, King Sargon of Akkad was already consulting his priests for predictions. They were the first known astrologers. In this regard, it should be noted that at the beginning, astrology was used only for predictions that concerned the kings. Many centuries had to pass by before astrology became a popular science. Only in recent times horoscopes are cast for ordinary people also. Over the centuries, the techniques have been progressively refined. Astrology can now take advantage of the most recent development of knowledge, as well as the direct contribution of some of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world. Originally, astrologers were also astronomers. They were capable of calculating by themselves all the positional data they needed to cast a horoscope. Claudius Ptolemy, Plodinus, St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Thomas Aquinas, Francis Bacon, Tommaso Campanella, Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and Carl Gustav Jung are only few of the several great men who have dealt seriously with astrology in the course of centuries. Here is the opinion of some of them. Aristotle. This world is necessarily related with the motions of the upper world. Any power in our world is governed by those motions. St. Thomas Aquinas. The celestial bodies are the cause of all that takes place in this sublunar world. They indirectly work on human actions, but not all the effects they produce are inevitable. Kepler. 20 years of practical studies have convinced my rebellious spirit of the reality of astrology. Goethe. On the 28th of August 1749, with the toll of the bell at noon, I was born in Frankfurt am Main. The constellation was auspicious, the sun was in Virgo, and at its culmination for the day. Jupiter and Venus looked amicably upon it, and Mercury was not hostile. Saturn and Mars maintained indifference. Only the moon, just then becoming full, was in a position to exert diverse force, because its planetary hour had begun. It did indeed resist my birth, which did not take place until this hour had passed. These good aspects, which astrologers in later years taught me to value highly, were probably responsible for my survival, or the midwife was so unskilled that I was brought into the world as good as dead, and only with great difficulty could I be made to open my eyes and see the light. C.G. Jung. To date, certain people with inadequate education still believe that they are capable of making fun of astrology, considering it as a pseudoscience unmasked a long time ago. Nonetheless, today astrology is rising from the depths and is knocking at the gates of our universities that it was forced to leave 3 centuries ago. This is another quote of Jung. We are born at a given moment in a given place, and like vintage years of wine, we have the qualities of the year and of the season of which we are born. Astrology does not lay to claim to anything more. The popularity of astrology has undergone ups and downs throughout the centuries. Astrologers have had moments of glory and of persecution, depending on many factors, including the personal opinion that the current prince, king, or pope had of it. In fact, perhaps this was the main factor indeed. There have been astrologers whom the Inquisition sentenced to be burnt alive, but there have also been popes as Sixtus IV who practiced and protected astrology. In Bologna, a professorship of astrology kept running uninterruptedly at the university from 1125 till the 18th century. Perhaps that was the most brilliant period for this so fascinating discipline. Later on, there was a decrease of interest due to the spirit of the Enlightenment, the discovery of the power of science, which was widely used to ward off the ghosts of medieval superstition. Unfortunately, this caused a vast witch hunt. People forgot to discriminate good from bad and tarred everyone and everything with the same brush. Thus, a huge cultural heritage risked being lost. It was only due to isolated actions of different scholars that astrology was not permanently banned. The pseudoscientists of the time tried to destroy it, but they failed because astrology, unlike other so-called esoteric sciences to which it is mistakenly compared, lies on a real, authentic, and verifiable ground. This is demonstrated by the fact that, with the advent of psychology, astrology became a modern, up-to-date discipline once again. With the help of the new science, astrology also became capable of expressing all of its archetypal and universal contents. In the first half of the last century, there was a real boom of interest around astrology, especially in Germany, where the astrologer Reinhold Ebertin founded the Academy of Cosmobiology, introducing new methods of analysis. Speaking of Germany, it is interesting to recall a page of history concerning the subject that we are dealing with. It is something that took place during the Second World War. The British counter-espionage used to ask the astrologer de Hol to predict Hitler's moves. In fact, the Allies believed that the German Führer followed the advice of a group of astrologers. In fact, things were not exactly like that, as explained by Elik Howe in his volume Gli Astrologi del Nazismo, The Astrologers of Nazism, published in Italy by Mondadori. Hitler did consult astrologers until shortly before his death. According to those astrologers, he claimed that the stars were bent to his will. In the early years of Hitler's dictatorship, there was a very famous astrologer in Germany, Karl Ernst Kraft, the author of several statistical works whose data later on proved to be partly false. With several months of advance, Kraft had predicted the exact date of the attack that would eventually fail to kill Adolf Hitler. He had therefore sent a letter to the SS command to warn them. When the attack actually occurred, the German secret police did not remember Kraft's letter. In fact, it would have been completely neglected if he hadn't had the bad idea of boasting of his own forecast in public. The astrologer was then arrested as a suspected co-conspirator. He was deported to a concentration camp along with all the other German astrologers there. He felt ill and died a few years later. In 1970, Neptune entered the sign of Sagittarius. As many had foreseen, there was a revival of interest in astrology. Today, this very same interest has become sort of inflationary. The current situation can be largely cleared up by some statistics conducted in France several years ago by Iris Marketing and by IFOP, the French Institute of Public Opinion, a situation that can be reliably assumed to continue at present. Those statistics show that 60% of the French read their own horoscope and 58% are interested in astrology. They also show that young people between 18 and 25 years are the most interested in astrology. In connection with their social status, at the top of the ranking we find clerks, 68%, immediately followed by managers. Then there are the workers, 63%, and finally the farmers, 44%. Despite having limited value, since they are merely a product of surveys, these results are particularly interesting. They indicate that, contrary to popular belief, it is not the people with lower educational level who are interested in astrology. It is exactly the opposite. In France, there is a vast interest in astrology. Thousands of professionals at all levels declare their interest in it. The same is the case with England, where there are real universities in which classes are held specifically on astrology. In Germany, Holland, Spain, United States, South America, and in many other countries as well, there still exists a strong popular interest in astrology. Not to mention East Asian countries, where the vast majority of people do not take any significant action without first consulting an astrologer. In the eyes of the general public, however, astrology continues to be related with the horoscopes on the magazines and with the activity exerted by the various wizards, warlocks, sorcerers, and pseudo-healers. Not everyone is aware that there is also, and above all, a scholarly, serious facet of astrology relying on a cultural background of thousands of years gone by. A lot of well-educated and cultured people of all social rank deal with this origin, kind of astrology. Currently, astrologers can be classified into two broad categories: the scientifists and the symbolists. The first group, which is identified in France as that of the conditionalists, consists of all those scholars who try to prove inductively the validity of what we have defined as the oldest science in the world. For this purpose, they mention the experiences of specialists in the fields of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Here are some of them. 1. American researcher Brown Jr. has proven that there's a strict parallel between a chart showing the lunar day and a chart showing the absorption of oxygen in potatoes, seaweed, carrots, etc. 2. A study on mice has shown that these animals, even if they are isolated in laboratory conditions, reach peaks of activity in relation to certain positions of the moon. 3. Similar experiments have been performed successfully on several species of sea mollusks. 4. French scientist Michel Gauquelin and later on his wife Françoise studied thousands of horoscopes of scientists, sportsmen, politicians, etc., discovering that the planets indicated by astrology as the markers of each of those professions can be effectively found in the strongest positions of their birth charts and with a much higher frequency than the frequency with which, according to probability theory, they would be detected over the same number of birth charts randomly chosen among other individuals. 5. In 1968 in Czechoslovakia, Dr. Jürgen Jonas was assigned the direction of a clinic near Prague for his studies on ovulation in women. In about 10 years of trials on thousands of women, he proved that there is a second day of monthly ovulation, irrespective of the cycle ogino-knaus, and set a method for predicting the sex of children of whom you know the day of conception. In his investigations, Dr. Jonas simply checked the position of the sun and the moon in the birth of the mother. In the late 80s, Dr. Jonas came and visited me in Naples. On that occasion, he claimed that his experiments had achieved important results, which had proven to be accurate on over 98% of the examined cases. 6. Physicians Schultz from Soviet Union and Takata from Japan have shown the connection between solar flares, the so-called sunspots, and a marked recrudescence of heart attacks occurring in men when these astrophysical phenomena take place. 7. The Italian physicist Picardi has proven the action of cosmic waves on liquids. Remember that the human body is made up mostly of water. 8. American engineer J.H. Nelson of RCA foresees the storms of radio-electrical disturbances that affect telecommunications by considering the planetary positions. This list could go on for many pages yet. Symbolist astrologers, on the contrary, stick to a psychological approach. They do not believe that you can get to make astrology a science. They think that the symbols playing a role in astrology cannot be quantified or catalogued, while not denying the validity of the scientific results obtained so far, and while not declaring themselves against a vision of astrology devoted to the principle of cause and effect. They prefer to categorize astrology as a phenomenon of synchronicity. For the sake of those who do not know the Jungian notion of synchronicity, let me elaborate. Carl Gustav Jung believed that in nature, besides the law of cause and effect, there also exists a law of synchronicity that can be defined as the experience of two or more apparently unrelated events occurring together, whose only mutual apparent connection is their having the same analogical meaning, regardless of the cause that produces them. Building on that concept, symbolist astrologers claim, among other things, that during the month of January, when the temperature is very low, nature is almost dead, water freezes, and so on, the sun is in Capricorn, and the human beings who see the light in that period are Capricornians, i.e., basically detached, rational individuals who show little compassion and little emotions. Conversely, in August, the natural world is at its best strength. The sun burns relentlessly, and in nature the principle of power, greatness, and expansion is constellated. Please note that when you read sun or moon in lowercase in my works, I refer to the astronomical body. Otherwise, you read them as sun and moon, respectively. During that period, people of the sign of Leo are born with strong, winning, and self-asserting temperament, and a predisposition to command. The same happens with any other astrological sign and symbol that can be interpreted from an analogical point of view. Statistics is one of the tools used by scientists to assert their ideas. Symbolists or conditionalists question the use of statistics. This is how André Barbeau explains why. The statistical method reveals the overall properties of a group and does not really deal with a particular, other than through the index of a generality of cases. Contrary to it, the analogical method starts from the unit, from the cell, from the original and irreducible factor, the human being. In its field of observation, the analogical method deals with the individual element, with a specific factor. It starts from the concrete, from existing individuals, Peter, Paul, John. This method of comparison consists in bringing together individuals with a common configuration and trying to find the analogical or common factors or elements in their lives corresponding to a specific configuration. This has to do with identifying all the individuals who show to possess the same astral phenomenon and extracting from them the manifestation, perhaps a manifestation expressed in different ways, of the same group of psychological tendencies. Beyond the internal disputes, which cannot be ignored, though, everybody can easily understand that astrologers have to fight their battles mainly against the old and the new enemies, who, for various reasons, try to reject the validity of astrology. They are almost daily called upon to defend themselves from a trite criticism, the tired question of the pseudo-displacement of the zodiac signs because of the phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. If one day the enemies of astrology resolve to partner and organize training courses in controversy, they would certainly put the utmost emphasis to the precession of the equinoxes, which they believe to be a question of primary importance, while it always ends up by proving to be absolutely insubstantial. The precession of the equinoxes is caused by the particular spinning motion with which the Earth's polar axis describes a cone in the celestial vault, as if it were a spinning top that is about to exhaust its activity. This implies that every year, on the day of the spring equinox, the sun does not face the same degree of the sidereal zodiac as the year before. This implies a shift of 30 degrees every 160 years or so. The move is retrograde with respect to the signs. It goes from Aries to Pisces to Aquarius to Capricorn, Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra, Virgo, Leo, Cancer, Gemini, and Taurus. In the 2000s of years preceding the birth of Christ, when astrology began to take shape on the day of the spring equinox, the constellation of Aries was in the direction of the sun. Today, the gamma point, 0 degrees of Aries, of the ecliptic is somewhere between the 1st degree of Pisces and the 30th of Aquarius. It was the Greek astronomer Hipparchus who first described this phenomenon around 150 BC. Later on, astrologers considered that the reference with the upper world should not be found in the fixed constellations, but in those areas of space between the Earth and the fixed constellations that hosts the sun in the different periods of the year. These areas, divided into 30 degrees each, are the signs of the zodiac. Since then, they have been bearing the name of the constellations, after which they were symbolically named. Clearly, astrologers know this fact since thousands of years. They have never made any confusion between the tropical and the sidereal zodiac, i.e., between signs and constellations. Our opponents may disagree on the validity of the tropical zodiac, but they cannot accuse astrologers to be subjects or objects of confusion in this regard. Some could and do argue that the alleged special values, which, according to astrologers, objectify a sign over another, are still unproved. This leads to another important criticism, namely, astrology is not an exact science. In fact, it is not. But is this a sin? Can it be said that medicine is an exact science? Is it not true that in front of an X-ray film, every doctor may express an opinion that may differ from those expressed by all of her colleagues? On the other hand, the same blame could be attributed to psychology. For example, why not ask psychologists to show the objectivity of the Oedipus complex or of the Cain complex on a microscope slide? Probably the only serious criticism that can be directed at astrology is that it has not been updating its symbols enough. In fact, it still uses too many old-fashioned material. This is true, but only in part. It is mainly due to the fact that since astrology was expelled from the universities, it has been practiced mostly by impostors and by individuals without culture. Nonetheless, astrology is currently experiencing a real collective revival. Many members of the intelligentsia all around the world are showing appreciation for its cultural roots. Thanks to this qualifying element, astrology is presenting itself to the world in an entirely new fashion. Despite the atavistic hostility that certain classes of the powers have always been showing against astrology, the astrologers are exposing the fruits of their work and also suggesting tests that can illuminate the skeptics. One such is the case of some very significant tests performed in 1961 in the United States by the psychologist Vernon Clark. They have been published in Jacques Sadul's The Riddle of the Zodiac, published in Italy by Palazzi, with the title L'Enigma dello Zodiaco. Clark contacted 23 astrologers of different nationalities who did not know the identity of the other fellow astrologers who were taking part in the trial. Clark also gathered a group of scientists to have them double-check the results. In the aforementioned work, Sadul writes, "Test number 1 aims to verify the claimed ability of astrologers to indicate the future talent of a person, starting from his or her date of birth. 20 astrologers were given 10 dates of birth divided into 2 groups, 5 men and 5 women. They were the real dates of birth of 10 real people, a musician, a teacher of arts, a prostitute, a herpetologist, a bookseller, a manufacturer of dolls, a vet, a professor of dramatic arts, a librarian, and an artist. The astrologers had to match each horoscope with the native's real profession. Of course, the sample used for this test consisted in a random group of people. Nevertheless, each of them had to fulfill 2 particular preconditions. They were to have been exercising their profession for a long time, and their profession was to be their main activity. Clark collected subjects between 45 and 65 years old, born in the United States, whose birth time was as accurate as possible. A control group was constituted, made of 20 psychologists who had to perform the same test, i.e., match each of the 10 people with their respective profession, based on the same data given to the astrologers, namely the list of occupations and the list of dates of birth. The results attained by the psychologists were consistent with the law of randomness, while the astrologers scored a probability of 100 to 1. It should be noted that 2 of the horoscopes of the sample belonged to people born on the same day of the same year, but at a different time. The interval between the time of birth of the prostitute and the time of birth of the librarian was 5 hours. Commenting on the results obtained, Clark declared, "This test allows us to conclude that the human characters are influenced or determined by the position of the planets at birth, and that the astrologers, solely on the basis of birth data, can identify and foresee certain characters." Test number 2 was as follows. 20 astrologers were given 10 pairs of horoscopes. A detailed history of a subject's life was added to each couple of horoscope, containing in particular the precise dates of a number of important events, such as marriage, accident, challenging journey, death. The astrologers were told that only one of the 2 horoscopes matched the story of the native's life, while the other belonged to someone of the same sex, more or less of the same age, and from the same place as the first, but who had had a completely different life. In reality, the false horoscope did not reflect any real person. It was simply built up from a random date of birth, with a difference of 1 year from the real person. The astrologers were obviously asked to detect which birth chart matched the described events of life. This is how Clark commented on the results. They are such that there's only one probability in 1,000 that they may be attained by chance. 3 astrologers were able to detect 100% of the horoscopes, 15 of them significantly exceeded the level of randomness, while the results attained by the other 2 astrologers were consistent with a random result. No one stood below the level of randomness. In the third test, 30 astrologers were given 10 pairs of horoscopes. Each pair consisted of the birth data of a person suffering from cerebral palsy at birth. The other was the birth chart of a person cleverer than the average, who had not suffered any other serious illness than the pediatric ones. The dates of birth of the 2 groups were also handed over to a group of physicians and psychologists working in contact with each other, who had also verified the dates in the records of the Registry of Births. The sample of 10 people was selected randomly among all the cases proposed by the physicians and the psychologists. Then their birth data was sent to an astrologer who had not participated in the previous tests, one who was famous for his precision in casting birth charts. He was commissioned to draw the 20 birth charts without being told the purpose of this operation, and of course, without being commissioned for any interpretation. He simply had to cast and draw the charts. The 20 charts were Xeroxed and sent without any further adjustment, nor detailed to a number of other astrologers who were taking part in the experiment. This time they were not given the stories of those people's lives. They were only informed that of each pair of horoscopes one belonged to a person with cerebral palsy, and the other belonged to a healthy, particularly smart individual. The astrologers were asked to identify out of the 20 the 10 birth charts belonging to those with cerebral palsy. The probability that their results could be attained by randomness was 1 against 100. 20 astrologers achieved the goal clearly above the law of causality. Other 10 astrologers reached the level of randomness and/or performed below it. Based on all the experiments described above, Clark reached the following conclusion. The ability shown by astrologers of making a distinction between true and false dates of birth is of great interest to the critics of astrology. For example, its opponents argue that there is no relationship between the state of the heavens and the human being, which implies that a horoscope is as worth exactly as any other, or that is not worth at all, in providing information about one individual or another. The fact that the astrologers were able to discriminate the false dates of birth apparently demolishes this skeptical position. The tests of Vernon Clark are only a few examples of how astrology could possibly be proven with experiments that take into account the very nature of our discipline. But if you want to get rid of any doubt about astrology, there is certainly a better way. The direct study of its statements and the practical verification that can be obtained day after day through the examination of the highest possible number of horoscopes. In contrast to many arts of divination, with which it is commonly and wrongly compared, astrology has an objective mathematical background that can be verified by anyone. The search for the final evidence of its credibility leaves a nasty taste in the mouth of either our detractors and our defenders. They would search in vain for it because there is not such a thing as a final evidence in astrology. The reason is simple. Every horoscope is different from any other. It contains a unique universe. Therefore, it cannot be really established in handbooks, tables, and clichés that are supposed to testify the correlation between the upper and the lower worlds. Nevertheless, these millions of unique universes represented by each individual horoscope are decipherable by means of a basic pattern resting on the main set of statements of astrology. Therefore, any sensible person with some experience of the subject and an average education can verify that astrology is a science, and that it does work indeed, provided that one is animated by good faith. Other sections of this book deal with the practical side of astrology. For now, before trying to answer our starting question, I find it useful to list the areas of daily life in which astrology can be particularly useful. Learning to know ourselves today, more than ever, human beings need an external aid to get to know themselves, having lost the physiological connection that used to link them with the surrounding reality. The study of the reactions manifestations of our body in relationship with the universal outside is no longer part of the activities practiced normally by humans. Having become increasingly attentive to the shallow behavioral patterns that the media constantly propose to us, we end up realizing only through neuroses that we do not really know ourselves in depth. And we suffer for this. The most valuable tools available today that can help us in this are psychoanalysis and astrology. The former is commonly recognized to be able to achieve the purpose of healing that we have just mentioned above. But it also has a negative factor, namely the sometimes excessive duration of its treatments. The latter offers a more rapid service, which is also independent from both the age and the willingness to cooperate of the subjects. Nonetheless, in order to achieve as valid results as those obtained by psychoanalysis, astrology must not be confined merely to the simple explanation of the horoscope. Above all, dealing with astrology requires a high degree of professionalism from the astrologer. In fact, a good astrologer should have performed a depth analysis in order to avoid the psychological phenomenon of projection on to the counselee. Pedagogical support and professional guidance to the young. This is the best field of application of astrology. A lady once asked Freud what the best way to educate children was. He said that he knew of no such, and that whatever the method, the results are always very bad. At least in part it is possible to disprove Freud's statement. For example, if parents are warned that their child, belonging to the sign of Leo, should never be humiliated in the presence of others, this practical piece of good advice would certainly help them achieve better results in his upbringing. Consulting an astrologer can help parents understand the most relevant aspect of the problems of their child. As far as possible, parents could then try to act according to a suitable therapeutic pattern, which the astrologer himself can suggest to them. Perhaps the best help that astrology can give to parents is assisting them in choosing the most suitable hobbies and courses of study for their kids. It can be assessed that many of the so-called child prodigies are adolescents who have simply had the chance to practice since young an activity that reflected exactly their best talent. An astrologer can suggest to the parents the most appropriate sports, arts, education for their sons and daughters. Thus, certain parents would avoid forcing their kids, say, to play the piano if they are hopeless at it, perhaps simply because it's them, the parents, who have this unrealized dream in their mind and hope to make it true through their children. Many of the anxieties that people develop in connection with work could be prevented if at the right time every child was led to choose not what they seem to like at a certain stage of their life, but what better satisfies their deepest desires and their hidden talents, even if at that point they might be completely unaware of what their own talents and desires are. Looking for the appropriate life partner If you're beyond the stage of romance, you can accept that the validity of the principle of marriage, or any equivalent bond, is not only the natural conclusion of a complex of feelings, but it is also, and above all, the choice of two adults who decide to unite their fates indefinitely after having rationally evaluated the pros and cons. If you accept it, then astrology can give you valid suggestions in this field also. I find that it is more correct being able to face reality and acting even against your own feelings if needed, rather than deluding yourself in the sweet oblivion of love, acting like an ostrich that hides its head in the sand. Sometimes the latter attitude only leads you to discover how bitter reality can be. And even if knots can be untied, things usually never revert exactly to their initial state. Astrology is able to assess the probability of marriageability between two people and to discourage, with the utmost clarity, those betrothed whose synastry do not guarantee the duration of their tie. The same goes for the choice of partners at work, study, etc. Recently, it has been reported that in England, birth charts have been used to match organ donors with prospective users, obtaining excellent results. Recruitment. Some major industries in the States already do so. In Italy, however, it's rather the smaller companies that usually ask an expert astrologer to assist them in recruiting personnel. From the moral point of view, in my opinion, the most acceptable way of doing so should be, for example, selecting 100 people and assigning each of them to the most suitable post. Thus, the company would have the maximum returns, and the workers would gain the best working conditions. Often, alas, the stars are used for purposes of secret police. This means that the employers simply want to determine whether the birth chart of the applicants show a tendency towards rebellion, dishonesty, laziness, etc. Health astrology can determine the pathological predispositions of an individual even if it's born today. Knowing it, you can put into practice various forms of preventive care for the native. You can select in good advance the most appropriate nutrition, the most useful corrective gymnastics, the best support therapies, the most apt profession, and so on. All of these choices can be capable of weakening, but it could also eliminate altogether, at their very initial stage, the pathologies that would probably affect that person. On the other hand, astrology proves to be more fallible when it comes to discovering the source of certain mysterious illness, whose diagnosis is complex even for official medicine. Not all astrologers agree on this point, but you must have the honesty to admit that the science of the stars also has limits. Recognizing the restrictions of astrology does not mean devaluing it. On the contrary, it rather means depicting it under a more real, positive, credible light. Analysis of world problems and its predictions. This is the most fallible field of application of astrology. This is not due to the imperfection of our science, but to our limitation of human beings trying to decipher the complexity of the worldly things. Keep in mind that there are a large number of variables that come into play in the analysis of such multifaceted reality like the economy of a country or its political evolution. To be able to say something valuable about the fate of a nation, you must assess and decipher, taking also into account their interrelationships, the horoscopes of the countries with which that nation holds stable political economic affairs. You have also to consider the birth charts of its leaders, of the opposition parties, and of anything else that may contribute inside and outside that country to influence the evolution of that nation, not to mention the problem of detecting which is the correct date of birth of a society or of a nation, an essential element to cast its horoscope. For example, not everyone agrees on the date of birth of Italy. Should we consider our unification during the Risorgimento, the declaration of our republic, or the moment in which our constitution came into force? 1,000 small daily problems. One day, if astrology gains the favor and the official recognition of power, as well as popular support, anyone could take advantage of it. For example, perhaps one day you can call for a 2-digit phone number and get astrological advice as you do today, to get weather information, timetables, road traffic, and so on. Thus, we would optimize the economy of our energies. You could then avoid going to a bookshop to buy a book when the moon is square to your natal Mars in the 3rd house. You could leave for your holidays when Jupiter enters your natal 9th house. You could make an important appointment in the most appropriate day. You could avoid visiting the dentist when the moon is either in Capricorn or Taurus. You could avoid showing off your skills as a diver if Mars is menacing in your birth chart, and so on with many other useful applications. Sure, you may say, all that will make life terribly boring because there would no longer be such things as unexpected events. Do not worry, though. There are so many uncertainties in out life that even astrology cannot foresee them all. And those who wish to live without astrology would always be allowed to switch it off. At this point, we can try to answer the starting question: is astrology a science or an art? Both the answer and the question could satisfy only those critics who wish to label astrology. Certainly it would not satisfy the astrologers who use it in practice. Having clarified this point, you can answer that astrology is both a science and an art. It is a science like psychology and other similar disciplines because you can verify its authenticity through an inductive method of study using the statistical method to get a partial feedback. It is a form of art because it hasn't got a sufficient number of objective encoded data to express all the physical, biological, psychological variables, just to mention a few of them, that characterize the human being. Thus, astrology needs to be used by a person who plugs its gap with his/her subjective, therefore more or less variable capacity of unveiling all the analogies that may hide in a given symbol. This is a crucial point, more important than any other consideration that can be made about astrology. End notes. 1. Here I refer clearly to the astrology of Mesopotamian origin and to the objective findings proving its origin, according to authors like Peucot, Boll, Beasold, and Gundel. Others prefer to rely on less objective evidence and fairy tales claiming that astrology has been brought to us from distant worlds. Let me repeat once again that I stick to historical evidence. On the other hand, I'm always ready to change my mind if I was proven otherwise. 2. E. Barbol, dalla psicoanalisi all'astrologia, from psychoanalysis to astrology, Edimne Morin. This phenomenon determines the ages, and that is why we say that we are emerging from the age of Pisces, and we are entering the age of Aquarius. The zodiac. Table 1a summarizes the structure of the zodiacal circle on whose background the sun seems to move in its yearly cycle. Each sign covers 30 degrees of the circe umferens. Their extension does not correspond to the constellations after which they were originally named. The starting and ending dates given for each sign are approximate. In fact, each year the sun enters a given sign at a different hour, and sometimes even on a different day than the previous year. With the help of the ephemerides in the appendix, you can get to know with accuracy the exact day and time of entrance of the sun in each sign in any given year. Table 1e shows the threefold division of the 12 signs into cardinal, fixed, and mobile signs, as well as their 4 elements: fire, earth, air, and water. This is a very ancient classification. It belongs to astrological tradition. These are the meanings of each subdivision: cardinal signs. These are the 4 signs marking the beginning of each season. They express the more distinctive features of their respective seasons. Fixed signs, these are the 4 signs of mid-season. They represent the fixing of the attributes of each preceding cardinal sign. Mobile signs, these are the 4 signs marking the end of each season and the beginning of the following one. They are characterized by instability of values. Fire, it implies values of strength, stamina, action, and control. Earth, it implies values of practicality, durability, stability, and constructiveness. Air, it implies values of communication, exchange, and relationship. Water, it implies values of sensitivity, emotion, imagination, and receptivity. The 12 signs are also classified into masculine and feminine, depending on their archetypal attributes. The signs of water and earth are feminine, the other signs are masculine. Notes on reading the characteristics of the signs. The 12 categories that you're about to read relate to the fundamental archetypes of each sign. In the following pages, you will be explained a concept in detail that I wish to brief here. I warn the reader to pay particular attention to it. Each sign constellates one or more keywords. In other words, each sign points to one or more basic symbols that can be experienced in what they usually represent, or in their very opposite. For example, one of the keywords of Leo is generosity. This means that in the reality of everyday life, you can meet exceptionally generous Leonines. Other Leonines may prove to be very selfish and greedy. Practical experience will teach you how to discern between the 2 kinds of zodiacal types. More than anything else, the careful consideration of all the values expressed by the birth chart will lead you to the precise deciphering of the archetypes contained in that specific horoscope. Rather than 12 signs, you should consider 6 axes mutually connected in dialectical opposition. In fact, you cannot talk of Cancer without considering the Capricornian rigidity that very often accompanies the character of Cancerians too. This phenomenon is called compensation. When compensated, natives of Virgo tend to behave more like they were typical Pisceans, and so on. In greater or lesser extent, this may refer to all signs. Therefore, you have to study carefully not only the characteristics of each sign, but also those of its opposite. Learn to discover the similarities of behavior in each pair. You will discover that Cancer and Capricorn can be either very humble or ambitious, that Virgo and Pisces can be either tidy or messy, that Gemini and Sagittarius can be either extremely superficial or very deep, and so on. Also, if we say that heart is the key organ of Leo, this should be intended both in the positive and in the negative. For example, this may imply that the man of birth chart, the reviewer 38, had a very strong heart that saved his life several times, but his heart also eventually caused his death from infarction. Be sure, then, to learn carefully how to read the conflicting dualism that lies within every sign, and to assign correctly the role of the Dr. Jekyll and of the Mr. Hyde who hide within each of the 12 signs. These 2 halves sometimes emerge separately at different stages of life. Some other times they appear simultaneously. So, for example, you can meet a native of Virgo who has an incredible order in his mind, e.g., he constantly tends to catalog, to outline, to set schedules, but who at the same time also lives in physical disorder, e.g., he is unable to make good use of the space in his room, his desktop is a mess, and so on. Why there is such thing as compensation mechanism, it is not entirely clear. We can only put forward the following hypothesis. The subject feels that the basic features of his sign are also his greatest obstacle, so he does what he can to behave in the opposite way to his deeper inclinations. Any diseases, unless there are contraindications in their horoscope, not being mentally weak, they are immune from the varied and impressive range of illnesses of psychosomatic and suggestive kind that may strike other people. Up to the age of 40, Leonines generally benefit from good health. Later on, they should pay particular attention to the heart, their most critical organ. The brain, the eyes, and the spinal cord are also very susceptible to diseases in Leo. The man of this sign is one of the better self-fulfilled ones of the zodiac. He looks for satisfaction and generally finds it in all his activities. At their home, nothing is missing. Indeed, Leo exaggerate in keeping the pantry and the refrigerator constantly packed with all of God's bounties. They adore to be called dad. They aim to surround their own image with a charismatic aura that imposes them to the attention of children against any other potential rival. Leonines with a prevailing consumerism. Of course, this depends on a number of factors in one's birth chart, may change women as if they changed cars, typically preferring the more elegant ones, those without any visible defect. Otherwise, they would not devote much space to their emotional life, preferring to live a traditional marriage. Women of this sign embody the ideal role of First Lady. They are the perfect wives for an important man, such as an ambassador, a captain of industry, or an authority in the field of arts. In fact, women of Leo know how to focus the other's attention on themselves, thanks to their charm and natural majesty. The woman of Aries is very uncomfortable with long dresses, while that of Leo is totally at ease in wearing exclusive garments. She would not seem ridiculous even if she wore a crown on her head, which ideally does happen, if you consider the majesty of her posture. Nothing can bring more joy to her than a gentleman adjusting her chair when she sits at a table while others are staring at her. She loves receiving expensive gifts and bundles of refined flowers. Although her political ideas lead her to deal actively with social issues, she cannot bear to stay in direct touch with misery and deprivation. Thus she tends to live in an expensive atmosphere where she can receive and give energy. She needs to have an important mate at her side, somebody she can display with pride. She's a great organizer at home, not a maid, though. For example, she refuses to perform menial and tiring jobs. She is passionate, capable of great emotional outbursts. She is typically loyal to her partner. In turn, the mate of a woman of this sign should never make the mistake of attempting to subdue her under his authority. She, too, like the man of Leo, is willing to exert power and tends to leadership. Especially at work, she would assert herself no matter what her job hierarchy is. For example, if she is a secretary, she would typically do her utmost to become the secretary of the boss. The children of Leo are passionate, loyal, generous, and free from meanness. They orbit around the figure of their father, whom they tend to imitate in everything. They are usually proud of him and tend to boast with their classmates. They try to impose their will on their friends and playmates. They do it naturally without forcing situations. They cannot bear to be humiliated. Normally, when they receive a criticism, they consider the others unfit to judge them. They tend to resist when somebody tries to influence their behavior or ideas. What their parents should teach to them is humility. In fact, young Leonines would lack modesty also in their adult age, unless a proper counteraction is set in due time.